The gunshot that killed Rebecca Young echoed through the canyon longer than it took for her to die, and Ryder Young had been listening to that phantom sound every night for 6 months in the empty ranch house where her laughter used to live. He stood at the kitchen window in the pre-dawn darkness of March 1878, watching the Idaho landscape emerge from shadow, remembering how she used to stand in this exact spot making coffee, humming songs she learned back east before they married. The stillness of the house pressed against him like a physical weight, every room a monument to absence, every corner holding memories that cut deeper than any blade. The ranch sprawled across 200 acres of good grazing land outside Twin Falls, Idaho. But without Rebecca's warmth filling the spaces between the walls, it felt like nothing more than wood and stone arranged in the shape of something that used to matter. Ryder was 32 years old, though grief had carved lines around his eyes that made him look older in the wrong light. He had built this ranch with his own hands over 8 years of backbreaking work. Every fence post and barn beam placed with the dream of filling the house with children and watching them grow under the big Idaho sky. Rebecca had shared that dream with a fierceness that matched his own, her green eyes lighting up whenever they talked about the family they would build together. Then a simple fever turned complicated, and the doctor from town arrived too late with medicines that did not work, and Ryder held her hand while she slipped away on a September evening with the windows open to catch the last warm breezes of summer. He buried her on the hill overlooking the south pasture where wildflowers grew in spring, marked the grave with a cross he carved from pine, and then walked back down to the empty house to begin the slow process of forgetting how to be happy. The ranch work continued because animals did not care about grief. Cattle needed feeding, horses needed tending, fences needed mending. Ryder moved through the days like a man underwater, performing tasks with mechanical precision while his mind drifted elsewhere. He spoke only when necessary, usually to his ranch hand Tom, who had the good sense not to offer empty condolences or suggest that time would heal anything. The house remained exactly as Rebecca had left it, her sewing basket still beside her chair in the parlor, her apron still hanging on its hook near the stove, her hairbrush still on the bedroom dresser with a few strands of her chestnut hair caught in the bristles. Ryder could not bring himself to move these things or pack them away, as if preserving her belongings might somehow preserve her presence in the world. March brought thawing ground and the first hints of spring to the Idaho territory. Ryder was mending the fence along the eastern property line when he saw the wagon approaching on the road from town, moving slowly as if the driver was uncertain about the destination. He straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool temperature, and watched the wagon turn onto his property. As it drew closer, he could see a woman driving, alone, with what looked like all her possessions loaded in the back. She pulled the horses to a stop about 20 feet from where he stood and climbed down with the cautious movements of someone who had been traveling for a long time. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with dark blonde hair pulled back in a practical bun and dust coating her simple blue dress. Her face was pretty in an understated way, with high cheekbones and brown eyes that assessed him carefully before she spoke. "Are you Ryder Young?" she asked, her voice carrying a trace of uncertainty. "I am," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. "What can I do for you?" "My name is Margaret Ellis," she said, and he noticed she did not smile or offer her hand, just stood there with her arms at her sides like someone preparing for bad news. "I saw an advertisement in the Twin Falls newspaper that you needed help with household duties. The notice was from last autumn, but I only just arrived in town yesterday, and the man at the general store said you had not hired anyone yet. He gave me directions out here." Ryder stared at her, confusion momentarily displacing the constant gray numbness he had lived with for months. "I did not place any advertisement," he said slowly. Margaret's face fell, disappointment and exhaustion mixing in her expression. "Oh," she said quietly. "I apologize for troubling you then. The store owner must have been mistaken." She turned back toward the wagon, her shoulders sagging in a way that suggested this was just the latest in a series of setbacks. "Wait," Ryder heard himself say, though he was not entirely sure why. She turned back, hope flickering tentatively across her features. "Someone must have placed that notice. Might have been Tom, my ranch hand, or maybe someone in town who thought they were helping. Either way, it is true that I could use help around the house. I have been neglecting things since my wife passed." The words felt strange in his mouth, admitting this need to a stranger. Margaret studied him for a long moment, and he had the uncomfortable feeling she could see more than he wanted to reveal. "I am sorry for your loss," she said, and the simple statement carried genuine feeling without the cloying pity he had come to despise. "I am a hard worker, Mr. Young. I can cook, clean, mend, manage household accounts, preserve food, and handle most everything that needs doing inside a home. I am not afraid of long hours or difficult tasks." "Where did you come from?" Ryder asked, partly from genuine curiosity and partly to delay making a decision he sensed would change things in ways he could not yet see. "Pennsylvania originally," Margaret said, "but most recently from a town called Silver Creek, about 100 miles north of here. I was working as a housekeeper for a family there, but the husband got it in his head that I was interested in him romantically, which I was not, and his wife dismissed me even though I had done nothing wrong. I came to Twin Falls looking for a fresh start and honest work." The story had the ring of truth, and Ryder found himself noticing details that spoke to her character. Her dress was mended but clean, her wagon old but well-maintained, her horses thin but properly cared for. She met his eyes when she spoke, not with boldness but with the straightforward gaze of someone who had nothing to hide and no energy left for games. "The position would be room and board plus $30 a month," he said, naming a figure slightly higher than standard wages. "There is a small room off the kitchen that has its own entrance. You would handle all household duties, cooking, cleaning, laundry, that sort of thing. I work the ranch from dawn until evening most days, so you would be on your own quite a bit." "That sounds more than fair," Margaret said, and this time she did smile, just slightly, relief evident in the way her posture relaxed. "When would you like me to start?" "Now is as good a time as any," Ryder said. "Let me help you unload your things and get you settled." Margaret's belongings fit in 3 trunks and a few boxes. Everything she owned in the world compressed into a quantity that barely filled a corner of the small room off the kitchen. Ryder carried the heavier items while she directed their placement, and he found himself noticing the titles on the books she unpacked, the careful way she handled a framed photograph of a couple he assumed were her parents, the simple cross she hung on the wall above the narrow bed. She worked efficiently, not chattering nervously to fill silence but comfortable with quiet in a way he appreciated. When her things were stored away, she tied on an apron and asked to be shown the kitchen and pantry so she could assess what needed doing. Walking through the house with Margaret felt surreal, seeing familiar spaces through her eyes. She did not comment on the layer of dust that had accumulated in unused rooms, or the dishes that had piled up in the kitchen, or Rebecca's belongings still scattered throughout like shrines to memory. She simply noted what supplies were low, asked about his preferences for meals, and inquired whether he had any specific routines she should maintain. Her professionalism created a buffer that Ryder found easier to navigate than sympathy would have been. "I usually eat breakfast before dawn, dinner around noon when I come in from work, and supper after dark," he said, standing awkwardly in the doorway while she examined the contents of the pantry with a practiced eye. "I am not particular about food. Whatever you make will be fine." "Do you have any dietary restrictions or foods you particularly dislike?" Margaret asked, making notes on a small pad of paper she had produced from her apron pocket. "No, nothing like that," Ryder said. "I should mention that Tom, my ranch hand, lives in the bunkhouse about 100 yards from here. He usually cooks for himself, but you can check with him if he wants to take meals in the main house. I will leave that between you two to sort out." Margaret nodded, writing something else down. "I noticed the garden plot behind the house has not been planted yet this season. Would you like me to handle that as well? I am good with vegetables and herbs." The garden had been Rebecca's domain, lovingly tended through 3 growing seasons before she died. Ryder had not been able to bring himself to touch it after she passed, and the plot had gone wild with weeds over the winter. "Yes," he said quietly, "that would be good. There are seeds in the barn left side on the shelf near the door. Rebecca bought them last summer with plans for this spring." He left quickly after that, not wanting Margaret to see whatever expression had crossed his face at mentioning his dead wife's name. Outside in the sharp March air, he gulped breaths like a drowning man breaking the surface, steadying himself against the reality that life was continuing whether he wanted it to or not. A stranger was in his house now, preparing to inhabit spaces Rebecca had claimed, touching things Rebecca had touched, standing where Rebecca had stood. Part of him wanted to run back inside and tell Margaret it had all been a mistake, that he could not do this, that the house needed to stay exactly as it was because changing anything meant accepting that Rebecca was truly gone. But he did not run back inside. He stood there until his breathing evened and his hands stopped shaking, and then he walked to the barn to lose himself in physical labor that required no emotional navigation. That first evening, Margaret called him in for supper with a simple knock on the barn door and a soft statement that food was ready. He found the kitchen transformed, not in any dramatic way, but in the restoration of order and cleanliness he had not realized he missed. The table was set for one, steam rising from a plate of beef stew with fresh bread beside it, a cup of coffee poured and waiting. Margaret was wiping down the counter with her back to him, giving him space to enter and sit without awkwardness. "This smells wonderful," Ryder said, and meant it. He could not remember the last time he had eaten a meal that was not cold beans or poorly fried meat. "Thank you," Margaret said, still not turning around. "There is more on the stove if you want seconds. I will be in my room if you need anything." She disappeared through the small door to her quarters before he could respond, and Ryder found himself grateful for her intuitive understanding that he needed to be alone. He ate slowly, savoring food that actually had flavor and care put into its preparation, and felt something small and fragile shift inside him. The house did not feel quite as empty with the sounds of someone moving around in the adjacent room, with the evidence of living presence in the cleaned surfaces and organized spaces. He was not foolish enough to call it happiness or even comfort, but it was perhaps the tiniest movement away from the abyss of grief he had been inhabiting. The days settled into a new rhythm. Ryder rose before dawn and found breakfast waiting, still hot, on the stove. He took his meals and then left for ranch work that kept him occupied, until exhaustion made sleep possible. Margaret moved through the house like a benevolent ghost, present but unobtrusive, slowly restoring order to rooms he had neglected and preparing meals that appeared at appropriate times without fanfare. They spoke little beyond practical necessities, and Ryder appreciated that she did not try to force conversation or ask questions about Rebecca, or attempt to fill silences with empty chatter. A week after Margaret arrived, Ryder came in for dinner to find her in the garden plot, already working to clear the winter's accumulation of dead growth and weeds. She had changed from her house dress into older work clothes, her sleeves rolled up and a wide-brimmed hat shading her face from the spring sun. He watched from the kitchen window as she moved methodically through the space, pulling weeds and turning soil, her movements efficient and practiced. Something about the scene caught in his chest, the sight of someone caring for something Rebecca had loved, bringing life back to a place that had gone dormant. He found himself walking outside without consciously deciding to do so, drawn by an impulse he did not fully understand. Margaret looked up as he approached, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand and leaving a smudge of dirt. "I hope you do not mind that I started on this," she said. "The soil is good, and it seems a shame to waste the growing season." "I do not mind," Ryder said, and surprised himself by crouching down to pull a particularly stubborn thistle from the corner of the plot. "My wife would have been glad to see someone tending this again. She loved growing things." It was the first time he had spoken about Rebecca to Margaret, and the words came easier than expected. Margaret did not freeze or offer condolences or make the moment awkward. She just nodded and said she had good taste in location. "This spot gets excellent sun and has natural drainage from that slight slope. I think we could grow wonderful vegetables here." The "we" was casual, not presumptuous, and Ryder found himself staying in the garden for an hour, working alongside Margaret in companionable silence broken only by occasional questions about what crops he preferred or observations about the soil quality. When they finally went inside, both dirty and tired, something had shifted between them. Not friendship exactly, but the first threads of connection between two people learning to exist in the same space. April arrived with warmer temperatures and longer days. The garden began to show green shoots where Margaret had planted early crops, and the ranch stirred to life with new calves and foals. Ryder noticed himself looking forward to meal times, not just for the food but for the brief moments when he and Margaret might exchange a few words about the day's events or the progress of the garden, or some small observation about ranch life. She had a quiet wit that occasionally surfaced in dry comments, and once or twice he found himself almost smiling at something she said. Tom, the ranch hand, had taken to eating breakfast and dinner at the main house, claiming Margaret's cooking was too good to pass up. He was a weathered man in his 50s who had worked for Ryder for 4 years, steady and reliable and mercifully free of nosiness. But even Tom noticed the change in atmosphere. "Place feels more like a home again," he said one morning while they were fixing a break in the fence line. "That Margaret is good people. You did right hiring her." "I did not exactly hire her," Ryder said, hammering a post into still frozen ground. "She showed up because of some advertisement I did not place. That would have been Mrs. Henderson from town," Tom said, grinning around the nail he held between his teeth. "She mentioned to me last winter that someone ought to help you out, that it was not healthy for a man to live alone in a house full of ghosts. I told her to mind her own business, but I guess she decided to do something anyway. I would say it worked out." Ryder paused in his hammering, processing this information. Mrs. Henderson ran the boarding house in Twin Falls and had been friends with Rebecca, had sat with her during those final awful days when the fever raged. The idea that she had cared enough to place an advertisement, to try to help him even when he would not accept help directly, created a complicated tangle of emotions he was not ready to examine. "I suppose it did work out," he said finally, and left it at that. One evening in late April, Ryder came in from the barn to find Margaret sitting at the kitchen table with tears streaming down her face, one hand pressed to her mouth to muffle the sounds of crying. She did not notice him at first, lost in whatever grief had overtaken her, and he stood frozen in the doorway, uncertain what to do. Every instinct told him to back away, to give her privacy, to avoid the messy complexity of someone else's pain when he was barely managing his own. But something deeper, some remnant of the man he used to be before grief hollowed him out, would not let him turn away. "Margaret," he said softly, and she jerked upright, hastily wiping at her face with her apron. "I apologize," she said, her voice rough with tears. "I did not hear you come in." "Dinner is ready, just give me a moment to compose myself." "The hell with dinner," Ryder said, surprising himself with the vehemence in his voice. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "What is wrong?" Margaret looked at him for a long moment, her eyes red and her face blotchy from crying, and something in his expression must have convinced her that he genuinely wanted to know. "Today is the anniversary of my parents' death," she said quietly. "They were killed 2 years ago when their wagon overturned crossing a swollen river. I was supposed to be with them that day, but I stayed behind because I had a cold. I have always wondered if I could have done something, made some difference if I had been there." The grief in her voice was raw and familiar, and Ryder felt an unexpected surge of connection, recognizing in her pain an echo of his own. "You could not have stopped it," he said. "Accidents happen, and all the wondering in the world will not change what happened. I know because I have spent 6 months asking myself if I could have done something different, gotten the doctor sooner, tried different medicines, anything that might have saved my wife. But the truth is sometimes people die, and there is nothing anyone could have done to prevent it." "Does it get easier?" Margaret asked, her eyes searching his face. "The guilt and the missing them and the feeling like part of you is just gone." "I do not know yet," Ryder admitted. "I can tell you it has gotten different. The first months after Rebecca died, I could barely breathe through it. Every morning I woke up and had to remember all over again that she was gone. Now the remembering is just there all the time, but it does not knock me down quite as hard. And some days I go hours without thinking about her, and then I feel guilty about that too." Margaret nodded slowly, recognition and understanding passing between them. "I left Pennsylvania because everywhere I looked I saw places they should have been. Their house, their church, their favorite shops. I thought distance would help, but I just carried the hole they left with me wherever I went." "That is the problem with grief," Ryder said. "You cannot outrun it or hide from it or wish it away. You just have to keep living alongside it and hope that eventually it becomes a weight you can carry instead of one that crushes you." They sat in silence for a while, the kitchen growing darker as the sun set outside the window. Finally, Margaret stood and began serving the dinner she had prepared, moving with the automatic motions of familiar tasks. Ryder noticed she set 2 places at the table instead of just one, and when she sat down across from him to eat her own meal, neither of them commented on the deviation from their usual routine. They ate together, talking quietly about small things and large things and nothing in particular, and when the meal ended, Ryder helped her wash the dishes while she dried and put them away. It was a simple evening, unremarkable in most ways, but it marked something new between them, a recognition that they were both wounded people learning to exist in a world that had taken things they could never get back. May brought warmer weather and the serious work of spring branding. Ryder hired 2 additional hands to help with the roundup, young men from town looking to make wages during the busy season. Margaret fed all of them breakfast and dinner, rising before dawn to prepare enormous quantities of food and somehow making it seem effortless. The house filled with noise and activity for the first time since Rebecca died, and while part of Ryder still ached at the change, another part felt almost grateful for the distraction and energy. He found himself watching Margaret more often, noticing the way she moved through tasks with grace and efficiency, the way she handled the sometimes rough humor of the ranch hands with good nature, the way her face looked in the early morning light when she was kneading bread dough with flour dusting her cheeks. These observations came without conscious decision, his awareness of her growing despite his attempts to maintain emotional distance. She was pretty, he acknowledged, but more than that, she was strong and capable and kind, qualities that mattered more than surface beauty. One afternoon, when the branding work was done for the day, Ryder walked up to the hill where Rebecca was buried. He had not visited the grave since Margaret arrived, unable to face the physical reminder of his loss while trying to navigate the strange new reality of someone else inhabiting Rebecca's spaces. But standing there now, looking down at the weathered cross and the wildflowers blooming around the grave site, he found himself speaking aloud for the first time since the funeral. "I hired a housekeeper," he said to the air, to the ground, to whatever remained of the woman he had loved. "Her name is Margaret, and she is kind and competent and has brought the house back to life. I think you would have liked her. I think you would have been friends." He paused, struggling with words for things he barely understood himself. "I still miss you every day. That has not changed and probably never will. But I am starting to feel like maybe I can keep living instead of just existing. I hope that is all right with you. I hope you would want that for me." The wind rustled through the grass, carrying the scent of spring earth and growing things. Ryder stood there a while longer, feeling something loosen in his chest, some small release of the guilt he had been carrying about moving forward with his life. When he walked back down to the ranch house, Margaret was in the garden watering the emerging plants, and when she looked up and smiled at him, he smiled back without thinking about it. The seasonal ranch hands left at the end of May, their work completed and their wages paid. The house grew quiet again, back to just Ryder, Margaret, and Tom for meals. Summer settled over the Idaho landscape with long, hot days and thunderstorms that rolled through in the evenings. Ryder and Margaret fell into an easy companionship, talking more freely now, sharing stories about their lives and dreams and losses. He learned that she had wanted to be a teacher before her parents died, that she loved reading novels in the evenings, that she sang softly to herself while she worked. She learned that he had grown up on a ranch in Montana, that he had met Rebecca at a church social and known within a week he wanted to marry her, that he played harmonica though he had not touched the instrument since she died. One evening in late June, Margaret asked if she could hear him play. They were sitting on the front porch after supper, watching the sun set in streaks of orange and purple across the western sky. "I have not played in a long time," Ryder said, the old reluctance rising up. "I am probably terrible now." "I do not mind terrible," Margaret said with a slight smile. "Music is music, even when it is imperfect." So Ryder retrieved his harmonica from the drawer where it had been gathering dust and played simple melodies while the evening deepened around them. His fingers were rusty and he missed notes, but Margaret listened with attention and something like peace on her face, and when he finally stopped, she said simply, "Thank you. That was lovely." "Rebecca used to say I played like a dying calf," Ryder said, the memory bringing unexpected warmth instead of pain. "She would cover her ears and laugh and beg me to stop. Then she had no appreciation for authentic cowboy music," Margaret said, her eyes twinkling with humor. "I thought it was perfect." Something passed between them in that moment, some recognition that they had moved beyond employer and employee, beyond grieving strangers sharing a house, into territory that was both exciting and terrifying. Ryder felt it like a physical thing, this awareness of Margaret not just as a capable presence, but as a woman he was drawn to, attracted to, interested in knowing more deeply. The realization brought immediate guilt, the feeling that being attracted to someone else was a betrayal of Rebecca's memory, even though his rational mind knew his dead wife would never have wanted him to spend his life alone. The summer progressed with long days of ranch work and quiet evenings that increasingly found Ryder and Margaret together, talking on the porch or working side by side in the garden, or simply existing in the comfortable silence of people who had learned each other's rhythms. Tom noticed the shift and approved in his silent way, finding more reasons to eat in the bunkhouse and give them time alone. The garden flourished under Margaret's care, producing vegetables that she preserved and canned for the winter months ahead. The house stayed clean and organized, filled with the smells of good cooking and the evidence of someone who cared about making a place feel like home. In July, a traveling preacher came through Twin Falls and held a revival meeting that half the town attended. Margaret mentioned wanting to go, and Ryder found himself offering to drive her in the wagon, an excuse to spend time with her away from the ranch. They dressed in their Sunday clothes and made the trip into town, and Ryder was acutely aware of how it must look to others, the widower and his housekeeper arriving together, sitting beside each other during the service. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house caught his eye and smiled with undisguised satisfaction, clearly pleased with how her matchmaking scheme had developed. After the service, the townspeople gathered for a potluck meal, and Ryder found himself introducing Margaret to people he had been avoiding for months, engaging in conversations he would have fled from before she came into his life. She was gracious and friendly, winning people over with her genuine warmth, and he felt a complicated pride watching her navigate the social situations with ease. On the drive home, with the sun setting and the horses moving at an easy pace, Margaret said quietly, "Thank you for taking me today. I have missed being part of a community." "I should be thanking you," Ryder replied. "I have been hiding from the world since Rebecca died. It felt good to be among people again, to remember that life continues whether I participate or not." "You were not hiding," Margaret said gently. "You were healing. There is a difference." "Maybe," Ryder acknowledged, "but I think I am ready to do more than just heal now. I think I am ready to actually live again." He did not look at her when he said it, but he felt her attention sharpen, felt the weight of unspoken things building between them. When they reached the ranch and he helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingered on her waist a moment longer than necessary, and her eyes met his with something like hope and fear mixed together. Neither of them spoke about it, but the air between them felt charged with possibility. August arrived hot and dry, bringing concerns about water levels in the creek that fed the ranch and provided irrigation for the garden. Ryder spent long days checking on the cattle and ensuring they had access to good grazing and water, coming home dusty and exhausted. Margaret took to leaving cool water and clean towels on the porch so he could wash before coming inside. Small acts of care that he had learned meant more than grand gestures. One particularly brutal afternoon, he came back to find her struggling to move a heavy barrel of water she had been filling for the garden, her face flushed with heat and effort. "Let me help with that," Ryder said, taking the weight from her before she could protest. He moved the barrel to where she indicated, and when he turned back, he found her watching him with an expression he could not quite decipher, "You are a good man, Ryder Young," she said quietly. "I hope you know that." "I am just a man," he replied, suddenly feeling self-conscious under her regard. "Nothing particularly special about that." "You are wrong," Margaret said, and there was conviction in her voice. "You have been kind to me from the first day I arrived uninvited on your property. You gave me work and a safe place to live when you had every reason to send me away. You have treated me with respect and consideration, and you have let me see your grief without pretending to be stronger than you are. That takes courage and character, and I want you to know I see it and appreciate it." Ryder found himself moving closer to her without conscious thought, drawn by the sincerity in her eyes and the need to close the distance between them. "Margaret," he said, and her name felt different in his mouth now, weighted with feelings he had been trying not to acknowledge. "I need to tell you something." "What is it?" she asked, and he could hear the slight tremor in her voice, could see the way her breathing had quickened. "I think I am falling in love with you," Ryder said, the words coming out rough and uncertain but utterly true. "I did not mean for it to happen, and I feel guilty as hell about it, because Rebecca has only been gone 10 months, but I cannot keep pretending I do not feel it. You have brought light back into my life when I thought everything would always be dark. You have made me want to be more than just a man going through motions. You have made me want to live again, really live, and I do not know what to do with that." Margaret stood very still, her eyes wide and shining with tears. "You do not have to do anything with it," she said softly, "but I need you to know that I feel the same way. I have been falling in love with you for weeks now, watching you slowly come back to life, seeing the man you are beneath the grief. I told myself it was foolish, that you would never see me as anything more than the housekeeper, that I was just a convenient presence in your life. But if there is any chance that you meant what you just said, then I need you to know that I love you too." The declaration hung in the hot August air between them, too enormous and fragile to touch carelessly. Ryder closed the final distance between them and took her hands in his, feeling calluses that matched his own, evidence of hard work and perseverance. "I meant every word," he said, "but I need to go slow with this. I need to know I am not just reaching for you because you are here and I am lonely. You deserve more than being a replacement for someone I lost." "I do not want to replace Rebecca," Margaret said, tears spilling over now. "I could never do that and would never try. But maybe there is room in your heart for loving someone new while still honoring what you had before. Maybe grief and love can exist together, not fighting each other, but just being two different truths at the same time." Ryder pulled her into his arms then, holding her while she cried and letting himself cry too, releasing months of pent-up emotion and fear and hope. They stood together in the dusty yard beside a barrel of water meant for vegetables, and it felt like the most honest moment Ryder had experienced since Rebecca died. When they finally pulled apart, both of them tear-stained and emotionally wrung out, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her forehead gently, a promise of more to come, but an acknowledgement that they both needed time to process what had just happened. The weeks that followed were tentative and sweet, a careful exploration of what they could be to each other. Ryder found himself reaching for Margaret's hand while they sat on the porch in the evenings, kissing her softly before heading out to work in the mornings, pulling her into his arms when she was washing dishes just to hold her for a moment. She responded with equal care, touching his face when she thought he looked troubled, leaving small notes in his lunch pail with encouraging words, singing while she worked in a way that filled the house with joy. They talked about their fears and hopes, about the guilt they both felt over finding happiness after loss, about the future they might build together if they were brave enough to try. September came, marking a full year since Rebecca's death. Ryder walked up to the grave site alone, needing to have a final conversation with his first wife before fully committing to a future with Margaret. He knelt beside the cross and spoke honestly about everything that had happened, about Margaret and the love he felt for her, about the guilt and confusion and hope all tangled together. "I will always love you," he said to the grave, to the memory, to the ghost he had been living with. "But I am choosing to love her too, and I think that is what you would want for me. I think you would tell me to stop being an idiot and embrace the second chance I have been given." That evening he asked Margaret to marry him with Rebecca's blessing, and his whole heart offered freely. They were standing in the garden where so much of their relationship had developed, surrounded by the late summer abundance of growing things. Margaret said yes through tears and laughter, and Ryder kissed her properly for the first time, deep and passionate and full of promise. They married in October in a simple ceremony at the Twin Falls Church with Tom and Mrs. Henderson, and a handful of townspeople as witnesses. Margaret wore a new dress made of pale yellow fabric that brought out the gold in her hair, and Ryder wore his best suit and felt genuinely happy for the first time in over a year. The wedding night was tender and nervous, two people learning each other's bodies and hearts with care and patience. Margaret moved into the main bedroom that had been Ryder's and Rebecca's, and while there was a moment of awkwardness as she rearranged things to make the space theirs rather than a shrine to the past, they navigated it together with honesty and grace. Ryder packed away most of Rebecca's belongings, keeping a few treasured items but making room for a new life with a new wife who deserved to live in a home that belonged to both of them. Winter came to the Idaho ranch with snow and cold winds, but the house stayed warm with Margaret's presence and the love they were building together. She became pregnant in January, and they spoke excitedly about the family they would create, the children who would fill the rooms that had been so empty. Ryder found himself imagining a future he had thought was lost forever, picturing toddlers running through the house and teenagers learning ranch work, and grandchildren visiting when he and Margaret grew old together. The pregnancy was healthy and uncomplicated, so different from the complicated medical issues that had plagued Rebecca. In September 1879, 18 months after Margaret first arrived at the ranch, in response to an advertisement she never should have seen, she gave birth to a son they named Robert after Ryder's father. The baby was healthy and loud, and Ryder held him with shaking hands and tears streaming down his face, overwhelmed by the miracle of new life after so much death and grief. Margaret recovered quickly from the birth, strong and resilient in ways that amazed him daily. She managed the household and the baby with equal competence, somehow making everything look easier than it was. Ryder fell even more deeply in love with her watching her mother their son, seeing the patience and joy she brought to every aspect of their lives together. The ranch prospered under their joint management, with Margaret handling the business accounts and household production, while Ryder managed the cattle and land. 2 years later, they had a daughter they named Mary after Margaret's mother, and the house that had been so empty and silent filled with the noise of children and life and laughter. Ryder would sometimes stand at the kitchen window where he used to listen for phantom gunshots and feel overwhelmed with gratitude that he had been given a second chance at happiness, that Margaret had appeared when he most needed her, that love could find him again even in the depths of grief. They visited Rebecca's grave together sometimes, Ryder and Margaret and the children, and Ryder would tell stories about his first wife, so the kids would know they had a kind of aunt watching over them from beyond. Margaret never showed jealousy or resentment about these visits, understanding that honoring the past did not diminish the present. She would hold his hand while he spoke to the grave, solid and real beside him, a reminder that he had survived the unsurvivable and found joy on the other side. Years passed in the way they do on working ranches, marked by seasons and cattle drives and children growing. Robert developed his father's quiet strength and love of the land, learning to ride almost before he could walk. Mary had her mother's practical competence and warm heart, taking charge of her younger siblings when they came along. Because they did keep coming, Margaret and Ryder eventually having 5 children total, 3 boys and 2 girls who filled every corner of the ranch house with energy and chaos and love. The ranch itself grew and prospered, becoming one of the most successful operations in the Twin Falls area. Ryder and Margaret worked as true partners, making decisions together and supporting each other through hard times and good. When drought came, they adapted. When cattle prices dropped, they diversified. When children got sick, or crops failed, or equipment broke, they faced it together with the resilience born from both having survived profound loss, and knowing that they could weather anything as long as they had each other. Tom stayed on as ranch hand for another 15 years before retiring to live with his daughter and boys. Before he left, he pulled Ryder aside and said, "I am glad you found each other, you and Margaret. Rebecca would have approved, I think. She always wanted you to be happy, and Margaret has made you happy. That is all that matters in the end." Mrs. Henderson from town visited regularly, always with a satisfied smile as if she alone had orchestrated the entire romance. In some ways she had, placing that advertisement that brought Margaret to the ranch at exactly the right moment. Ryder and Margaret never told her directly how grateful they were, but they made sure she knew she was always welcome at their table and included her in family celebrations as a kind of honorary grandmother. As Ryder grew older, silver threading through his dark hair and lines deepening around his eyes, he would sometimes think about the man he had been in those dark months after Rebecca died. That hollow ghost moving through an empty house, convinced that happiness was something that only existed in the past. He felt compassion for that younger self, but also gratitude that he had not stayed frozen in grief, that he had been brave enough or desperate enough or lucky enough to let Margaret into his life and heart. One evening when the children were grown and scattered to their own adventures, Ryder and Margaret sat on the porch watching the sun set over the Idaho landscape they both loved. 40 years had passed since the day she arrived in a dusty wagon with all her possessions and nowhere else to go. 40 years of marriage and partnership and love built on the foundation of shared grief and hard work and commitment to showing up for each other every day. "Do you ever regret it?" Margaret asked, her head resting on his shoulder in the easy intimacy of decades spent together. "Taking a chance on the stranger who appeared at your door claiming there was a job you never advertised?" "Not for one single second," Ryder said, kissing the top of her head where silver now mixed with the blonde. "You filled this ranch with warmth when it was nothing but empty cold rooms and ghosts. You gave me back my life when I thought it was over. You made me believe in second chances and new beginnings. How could I possibly regret any of that? I am glad," Margaret said softly. "Because you saved me too, you know. I was so lost when I came here, running from grief and pain and not knowing where I belonged. You gave me a home and a purpose and a love I never expected to find. We saved each other, I think." "We did," Ryder agreed, his arm tightening around her. "And we built something beautiful in the process." They sat together as full darkness fell and the stars emerged overhead, 2 people who had found each other in the wreckage of loss and built a life that honored both the past and the future. The ranch house behind them glowed with lamplight, and even though it was mostly empty now with the children grown and gone, it still held the warmth Margaret had brought all those years ago. That warmth had never left, sustained by the love they had chosen every day, through grief and joy and everything in between. In the distance, up on the hill where Rebecca was buried, wildflowers still bloomed every spring, and Ryder still visited occasionally to tell his first wife about his life and thank her for letting him go, for not holding him to a grief that would have destroyed him. He liked to think she was happy for him, proud that he had found Margaret and built a family and lived fully instead of just existing in the shadow of loss. The moon rose over the Idaho range, casting silver light across the land Ryder and Margaret had worked together for 4 decades. Inside the house, in drawers and closets and on shelves, evidence of their life together accumulated in photographs and mementos and the worn furniture that had witnessed their journey. The ranch would continue after they were gone, passed to their children and eventually grandchildren, a legacy built on second chances and the courage to love again after devastating loss. But on this particular evening, Ryder and Margaret were content to simply sit together and watch the night deepen around them. 2 people who had found each other when both most needed finding, who had built warmth and home and family from the ashes of grief, who had proven that the human heart was capable of healing and expanding and loving again, even after being shattered. Their story was not one of forgetting the past, but of honoring it while still embracing the future. Not of replacing lost love, but of making room for new love alongside the old. As the stars wheeled overhead and the night sounds of the ranch settled around them, Ryder Young held his wife close and felt complete in a way he once thought impossible. The Cowboy's ranch was no longer empty, no longer echoing with silence and loss. Margaret Ellis Young had filled it with warmth and life and love, and in doing so, had given both of them the greatest gift imaginable, a second chance at happiness. Hard-won and deeply cherished, built to last through all the remaining years they would share together on the land they both called home.